My name is Jonathan Couey. I'm the chief biologist of Gigaohm Biological. It's a high-resistance, low-noise information stream brought to you by a biologist. Today, I have a psychologist. I'm going to let her introduce herself and her credentials and her background. But suffice it to say that she brings a very different expertise to the channel. And I missed that transition. I apologize. She brings a very different expertise to the channel, which will allow me to rest a little bit and sit back and listen and learn. But more importantly, share with you this perspective, which might shed some light on some of the ideas that have percolated through the alternate media in the last 6 months. One of them being this mass formation idea, which has been made famous through the amplification of Robert Malone, one of the people that has adopted it as a good idea. The author of it is supposedly somebody from Belgium, or I think it's from Belgium. And so part of what I think makes Meredith's contribution to our thought processes here so relevant is that she brings an alternative theory to this mass formation. I don't think she's going to necessarily tell us that mass formation is right or wrong, but instead remind us of some things that we knew already before the pandemic and we understood before the pandemic, and remind us that maybe some of these ideas, like, for example, the immunology that we knew before the pandemic and the epidemiology that we knew before the pandemic, is also relevant. And so I think she would agree that a lot of this is an illusion that's sustained only through our active participation. You got to watch TV, you got to buy into the narratives, you got to listen to their information, and you've got to believe in it. But again, I'm already overstepping my bounds in my mind. I'm putting you on screen right now, Meredith. Thank you very much. The music is fading. As I said, I would just like you to introduce yourself to my audience, knowing that they are 100% on board with what I think you're going to say, and maybe even more importantly, they will be on board with sharing your message afterwards. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thanks so much for inviting me, JJ. I'm Meredith Miller. I'm a holistic coach and author, so I'm not a psychologist. What I'm going to offer is a perspective that I think a lot of psychologists are not seeing. This is also something that I've done over the years, working with victims and survivors of narcissistic abuse and other toxic relationships. So I'm going to talk about what happens from the micro abusive relationship to the macro abusive relationship, which we're experiencing now in society since 2020. It didn't start in 2020, of course, it was decades building, but it became very intense in 2020. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
And that works. Perfect. Thank you. Awesome.
So I'm going to talk about the psychoneurospiritual state of captivity that has been induced in the people during the last 3 years. This is going to explain how the violation of consent took place during COVID. And it's important to understand this because this is going to be the same behavioral response that's going to be induced in ongoing tyranny, as JJ, I'm sure, talked about with the digital ID and everything that's going to come later. So it's important to understand that this state of captivity we're in is not just a physical captivity. It doesn't have to be a hostage situation. This captivity is psychological, neurological, and spiritual. So it's affecting us at the body, mind, spirit level. So this is the micro to macro vision bridge of the psychological abuse dynamics that I see in relationships. There is an abuse cycle. We call it a cycle of violence that causes a trauma bond. It's also known as Stockholm syndrome or traumatic entrapment. It has many names, but it's essentially the same form of captivity. Compliance is the goal here. So when we're dealing with a covert abuse situation, which we're seeing in the world, covert meaning it's hidden, it's disguised as good, it's disguised as for your good. And the people who are carrying it out are pretending to be your heroes and saviors. So they can't force themselves upon you. That would be very obvious. They need to get you to comply. They need your voluntary consent. They're going to use this to get you to follow the COVID measures. We saw this all the way along, from the social distancing, the masking, the testing. They used it to get people to get vaccinated. They used it to get people to develop an irrational loyalty to and an emotional dependency upon the perpetrators and that whole abusive system, so that they can transition us into the digital slavery system. So I'm going to talk about the 4 parameters that induce this state of captivity, and you're going to see exactly how this has happened in the last 3 years. I'm going to name specific examples, and you'll start to see how this fits together. Those 4 parameters are isolation, a perceived act of kindness, a perceived life threat, and a perceived inability to escape. So the isolation can be physical and or psychological. It's most important, the psychological aspect, because the key here is that the target has no access to outside perspectives. The goal is for the target to be fully subscribed to the perpetrator's narrative, creating the result of the domination of the perception of reality. So it's important to also understand that social isolation induces a state of disconnection. Our autonomic nervous system as mammals uses neuroception. What does that mean? It's always scanning the environment for cues of safety and threat. And as mammals, our autonomic nervous system reads social isolation and distance or disconnection as unsafe, as a life threat. That's important to understand. There's also a very long history of scientific studies that are showing the damages that social isolation causes on a person's physical and mental health. So that prolonged isolation also causes chronically elevated stress hormones, and then that changes our nervous system. So after the period of prolonged isolation, what happens is people become irritable and aggressive when they're given the opportunity to form social bonds again. So examples that we saw of this isolation since 2020, the domestic confinement, social distancing, elderly abuse, where the elderly in care homes were isolated from their family members. They weren't able to have any contact with people. We saw the technological delivery of the perpetrator's messaging. This is very important. How did they lock us into that narrative? Because people were at home, they were on all their devices, they were digesting media, social media, they were going to corporate websites. Even when you went on an essential grocery shopping trip, you went to the grocery store, you're walking around picking up the things on your list, and in the background, on the loudspeaker, bombarding your subconscious, is them telling you to stay 6 feet apart, to wear your mask, to stay at home and get delivery, to get vaccinated when you can. So we saw this corporate lockstep along with all the social media and media, as well as everything you were hearing from the public health officials. So we saw a tremendous amount of information control. This is the isolation, the core of the isolation. We saw censorship, propaganda, fact-checking. Then anytime anyone, including doctors, proposed something that was alternative to that narrative, they were silenced and smeared. So that's how the isolation takes place. The second parameter is the perceived act of kindness. So this is key in abusive situations. It's part of that abuse cycle. It's intermittent reinforcement. So it's sweet and mean or sweet and cruel. And what happens is an abuser has to do this in order to get you to think that they care about you. So the key here is perceived act of kindness. It doesn't matter whether it's real kindness or whether it's what we call love bombing, which is fake kindness. It's a tactic used to gain your trust. It's also used to get the target to relax their guard, to not be, checking out, are there alert signs here? Is something wrong here? Also, this act of kindness is used. Let's say the target starts to wake up, they start to distance themselves or leave the perpetrator, the abusive situation. The perpetrator will use the act of kindness to pull the target back in. So what does this do? It induces a state of cognitive dissonance. That's when a person has two very conflicting and opposing belief systems. For example, part of them knows that something is off and this isn't right and they're being mistreated, but part of them really wants to believe that this person is the love of their life or that the government really wants the best for them. And so what happens is that conflict, that dissonance creates so much stress in the mind that it induces states of denial and defensiveness, and it causes the person to want to see the good in the abuser or want to get back to the good times, or what you heard in society was people wanted to get back to normal. So that inconsistency of reward and praise creates the result of the target will work harder, invest more, and develop an almost obsession with compliance, no matter the increasing absurdity of the things to which they need to comply. So some examples of these perceived acts of kindness that we saw: first, they would lock people down, then they would restore some freedoms or loosen some restrictions. We saw the free vaccine. We saw incentives to get vaccinated. Some states in America were offering guns and cheeseburgers and hot dogs and donuts, and you could maybe even win up to $1 million in a lottery or go to Las Vegas and get a free lap dance from a stripper if you got your vaccine at the strip club. We saw government stimulus money, unemployment benefits, forbearance on mortgages and student loans. And most importantly, we saw a lot of promises of safety. We heard things like, it's for your protection, it's because we care, it's to keep you safe. And even those little intentional dosing of truths here and there, it can also be perceived as an act of kindness. Why? Because it tricks the brain into that state of hope, thinking we're finally going to go back to normal because the truth is all coming out. So the third parameter is the perceived life threat. This was delivered through the bombardment of fear messaging that we got from those media that I mentioned. The key here again is perceived. The neurological system, whether it's a real life threat or not, as long as the autonomic nervous system reads it as a threat, the goal here is to create that cue of threat that's read by the autonomic nervous system. Why? Because it induces what's called a freeze state. This is a collapse of the autonomic nervous system, or what's called immobilization. So think of a mouse when it gets caught by a cat. It's hanging in the mouth of a cat. The mouth feigns death. It's not trying to do this, but its neurological system starts shutting down. It shuts down heart rate. It shuts down respiration. It shuts down bodily functions in order to feign death. That's a last ditch survival mechanism. Now, let's say that the cat sees a Doberman pinscher. So the cat maybe drops the mouse. Then the mouse's mobilization kicks in the autonomic nervous system, and it can flee. So it goes into the fight or flight. The fight or flight is one step above the freeze state. The freeze state is the lowest state of consciousness that a human can get locked in, that state of collapse. And that's what happens when there's a bombardment of fear threat over and over again. It causes us to go into this freeze state. So when people are in that state, they become completely closed off to new information. So if they got all this information of, the perpetrator's messaging in that narrative, and you show up and you want to show them some new information and they can't even look at that, what happens inside the body is they go into a metabolic shutdown. Their immunity is decreased, which is very alarming because allegedly we're in a pandemic. So immune system should be something important. And obviously they know the science that fear, worry, chronic stress causes decreased immunity. Also, what happens when a person goes through this state is there's a numbing of pain in their body. This is not a choice. We have endogenous opioids that will kick in when the pain is so strong, and that can be emotional and psychological pain. And so in a way, that's a survival mechanism, so we can keep going despite that pain. But over the long term, what happens is we become numb. That's one of the causes of stress. One of the results of stress is that we actually become numb. Then it becomes difficult to feel. It becomes difficult to feel what's wrong. It becomes difficult to feel our life situation. So we're starting to lack information that's really important in order for us to find a way out. So a person can get stuck in a brain fog. It becomes very difficult to think clearly due to this shutdown and collapse. And a person starts to feel very lost and alone. And of course, as humans, we have to adapt to this kind of situation. So we can't be completely collapsed all the time. We begin to adapt into states of dissociation. What does that mean? It's like you check out, you zone out of your body. Maybe you've noticed before, sometimes you kind of lost track of a few minutes or something because you just weren't really present. That's dissociation. When it's too painful to be present in the body, the mind will disconnect due to that long-term ongoing sense of life threat. So what was the life threat? Well, for some people, they saw the virus as a life threat, even though that wasn't true for most people. And they also saw people as vectors of the virus, so they were afraid of other people. And for those of us on the other side who are more aware of what's going on, there was the very real life threat, and is the very real life threat, of tyranny. So the fourth parameter of Stockholm Syndrome is the perceived inability to escape. So this goes on over a period of time, and it's not a linear process. Okay, all of these parameters are getting layered and stacked like octaves, one upon another, building this state of captivity. So the key here to sense the inability to escape is that the target feels trapped. The target starts to learn that resisting the abuse is more painful. On an interpersonal level, an example is the woman who's being raped by her husband. That's called marital rape. And she learns that if she fights him, that's only going to prolong the pain. It's going to lead to more pain, longer time. So she decides just to let him get it over with. The goal here is that the target develops a dependency on the perpetrator for survival, a dependency on the perpetrator's narrative, a dependency on the perpetrator's help or acts of kindness, a dependency on that perpetrator. They start to have the perception that they can't. The mind starts to tell themselves, I can't leave. Even though most abuse victims leave the house every day. They go to work, they go to take the kids to school, they go to the grocery store, they do life, and then they go back home. So again, it's not about being locked into a physical prison. That prison is internalized. It's a psychological state, it's a neurological state, and it's a spiritual state. So it creates this state of learned helplessness. What is that? That results in a sense of debility, dependency, dread. And over time, that becomes apathy. A person starts to not care anymore, to lose their drive to keep striving or to keep trying. They feel powerless, hopeless, and they start to sense that they have a lack of control over their life. Their brain is telling them, I can't do anything to get out of this situation. I can't do anything to make this any better. When we're locked in that state of lower consciousness, we don't have access to our states of higher consciousness, which is where we have creativity and imagination. So if we can't even imagine the way out or create the way out in our mind, how do we ever get out? And in this state, over a long period of time, a person develops an existential exhaustion. They just don't have the energy. Sometimes when you try to show people things about what's going on in the world, it's not that they exactly disagree with you. Maybe they don't even disagree with you, but they are so exhausted and overwhelmed and in that state of despair that they just don't have the energy to even look at it. So over time, this creates a state of spiritual bankruptcy. What that means is a loss of all faith. A person starts to feel completely disconnected from everything and everyone. And in that state of losing all faith, the only thing that's left is emptiness. And that's perhaps one of the most devastating states that a human being can live in. So examples of why did people feel like there was an inability to escape? How did this happen? We saw goalpost moving. This is very common in abusive relationships. That goalpost just keeps moving. So at first it was 2 weeks to slow the spread, to stay home, and then it became a month, and then that got extended. And at first they said it was going to be 2 doses of a vaccine, and then a booster, and then another booster, and then, well, you need to come back every 6 months to a year. And what we saw was that the vaccine was positioned as the only way out. You saw this in the messaging. So what happens? Just like that woman who's getting raped by her husband and she decides, just let him get it over with. How many people have you heard say, you know, I just decided to get it over with and I got the shot so I can get my life back. So in this state of spiritual bankruptcy, of learned helplessness, of feeling that you can't escape this life situation, a person will turn to escape isms. So they will turn to things like fantasy. A fantasy is an escape from reality. We saw alcohol sales soar since 2020. We saw drug addictions and overdoses soar in the recent years. We saw lots of different addictions hitting peak. And then when this gets really extreme, people can even turn to self-harm and suicide. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're hearing a lot more about assisted suicide programs. For example, in Canada, they've come up with one, medically assisted suicide, they call MAID, as if human beings are something dirty to be cleaned off this planet. So this state of captivity has devastating long-term impact. That those escapism tendencies lead to self-destruction. So when you're dealing with abusers that want to pretend like they're philanthropers and humanitarians and they just want to help and they're just such great citizens, they can't look like they're destroying you. They have to get you to destroy yourself. That's key here. And so this ongoing compliance with abuse, because that's really what the Stockholm syndrome leads to. That's what this state of captivity is. That's what the trauma bonding is a person appeases the abuser. They learn to survive by fawning, by appeasing the abuser. And that leads to more abuse, more tyranny, more traumatization. You saw a lot of people had the misconception that if they complied, that would end the abuse, but that's not reality. And so over time, this leads to a devastating loss in a person's self-worth, self-esteem, self-trust, their whole sense of self. People are losing sense of who they really are. That creates also an increased vulnerability. So a person will become more vulnerable to physical and mental health decline. For example, when I work with clients who have been in abusive relationships for 10, 20, 30 years, they almost always have multiple chronic illnesses. So this neuro-spiritual exhaustion and powerlessness begins to permeate a person's life. They begin to become dysfunctional in their life, and they develop a high probability of repetition. So on a personal level, a person goes through an abusive relationship, or they come from a family and a childhood that was based on abuse or neglect. They tend to unconsciously seek the same thing because their neurological system was programmed to recognize that as love and home. So in society now, people have been programmed into this state of captivity. And even though most of them right now are in denial, thinking everything's normal, that was some distant dream that happened in the last 3 years and it's over, it's not. Those same people have a very high probability of falling into the same behavioral response to the next campaign. So a lot of people are asking, well, why aren't psychologists talking about this? And it's something that I've asked a lot over the years about narcissistic abuse in general. Narcissistic abuse is not a scientific term. It's a layman's term. It's a keyword term that people will find online, and that's how they end up finding information to understand what happened to them. But predominantly, it's psychological abuse. And unfortunately, as many of my clients who are therapists and psychologists, and even some with PhDs told me, they were not trained to recognize psychological abuse. They were trained to recognize physical abuse and sexual abuse, but they also weren't trained to recognize the covert types of abusers. And in my opinion, the covert types are far more dangerous because it's evil disguised as good. It can go so much further, so much deeper, beyond the point where a person even sees what's happening. By the time the person realizes what's going on, it's so late. Also, these concepts are not in the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatry. It's basically the Bible of psychiatry. It's used for two purposes. One, to give a diagnosis for insurance billing, and two, to give a diagnosis to match up with a pharmaceutical drug. So it's used for billing and pharmaceutical sales. So really anything that doesn't make money or fit into that doesn't really fit into this book. It's interesting to note that both psychopathy and covert narcissism are not in that book. When we look at the 4 cluster B personality disorders, where they talk about the narcissist and the antisocial personality disorder, the description of the narcissistic personality is the overt form. First of all, it's a very poor explanation of what that actually looks like in real life. But also it's the overt example. It doesn't explain what the covert form looks like. And the antisocial personality disorder is what we laymen call sociopathy. I interviewed a few years before this whole COVID thing started a PhD in psychology, and he explained to me the difference between psychopathy and sociopathy. So he said that antisocial personality disorder is what laymen call the sociopath. That's the more impulsive, overt criminal who gets caught kind of personality. That would be what they call factor 2 psychopathy. And factor 1 psychopathy is the charming, covert, calculated, meticulous, calm sort of personality. So that sociopath personality is very impulsive, but the psychopath factor 1 personality is very much invested in an agenda and the long con. They're not caught up in that impulsive action. And so what this PhD told me is that psychopathy is a field of study, but not a diagnosis. So how's that for cognitive dissonance? You can study it, therefore it exists, but you don't diagnose it. So it kind of doesn't exist, but really psychopathy is the true epidemic of our time. So another thing that's not in the DSM is complex PTSD. This is the kind of PTSD that a person will develop growing up in an abusive or neglectful household or going through a long-term abusive relationship. It's what people are developing in the world now, where they learn to appease the abuser, to comply, to fawn as a survival mechanism. And of course, the Stockholm Syndrome is not in the DSM. It's not a mental diagnosis. It's not a mental illness. The Stockholm Syndrome, the state of captivity I'm talking about, is a survival mechanism. It's a behavioral response to trauma, abuse situations. And there's also an interesting push to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of the Stockholm Syndrome. I heard this over the years among some psychologists when I talked about Stockholm Syndrome caused by abusive relationships. They kind of, pushed it away. And if you read the Wikipedia entry on Stockholm Syndrome, of course, Wikipedia is very politically biased and whatnot, but they refer to it as a theorized condition that's rare. And so all of this really is an interesting minimization of the core concepts that are most important to understand in order to make sense of what's been happening in the world in the last 3 years and what's going to keep happening. So of course, then there's very little academic research on these topics, though now there's so much data based on what's going on that I think in the future, they'll be able to look back and actually have a lot of research if they want to look at it. Also, why aren't psychologists speaking up? Well, many of them have been threatened to toe the line with the public health messaging. They're afraid. A lot of them are afraid of the virus. So they went into that Stockholm Syndrome themselves. And some of them are on our side and they see what's happening, but because of cowardice, they're not speaking up. And of course, then there's a small group of psychologists who are complicit with the perpetrators. They're enabling the abuse. They're trying to get people to take these harmful injections. They're giving endorsements of those products. They're also conforming to that public messaging, public health messaging in order to maintain their license or their professional memberships. And worst of all, I saw a memo written and co-signed by a group of trauma experts, psychologists and trauma experts. That is their focus of their work. And it was called A Trauma-Informed Approach to Vaccine Fear. They wrote this to the Biden administration. And the whole thing is about how to spin the language to get trauma survivors who are vaccine hesitant to go ahead and take the shots. And unfortunately, on the list of the experts who co-signed on that memo are world-renowned trauma experts who you would think would be the first people to recognize what's going on. So I want to dispel some liberation myths. These are the myths that I've seen among clients over the years and survivors of abuse. And these are the same myths that are going to be happening in the world. Liberation is not just waking up, right? The waking up is the awareness you have when you're still in it. Liberation is also not when the truth comes out. So let's say tomorrow, all the truth suddenly comes out. That's not the same as liberation. Liberation is also not just leaving the abuser or the abusive situation, because that state of psycho-neuro-spiritual captivity can go on for years or decades after a person leaves the abuser in an abusive situation. Liberation is also not when the abuser is in jail or when they're dead for the same reason I just mentioned. And liberation is also not found in a rescue fantasy or through a savior. So one of those fantasies that a person can develop in the escapism tendency when they're in that state of captivity is hoping that someone or some white hats or some group of people is coming to save them. But we actually have to save ourselves. So the most important question is, okay, what now? What's the way out? True liberation comes through an ongoing commitment to self-responsibility and self-discipline of one's thoughts, words, behaviors, and choices, because this is what's being provoked. They're provoking an emotional reaction so that we don't consciously choose our response. So the very first thing that a person needs to do when they wake up in an abusive relationship or situation is to withdraw their consent in any ways that they've been giving away their consent, that their consent was violated and they didn't realize they were consenting to things they're not okay with. And then to start opting out as much as possible. So in abusive relationships, we use the term no contact. We say, you go no contact with the abuser, you completely cut them off. But in this case, it's not exactly possible because we're all dependent to some degree upon the collapsing structures and systems of our society until new ones are formed. So in this early stage, of a survivor of abuse will need to be able to identify the abuse and articulate what happened. So at this stage, a person starts to get an almost ravenous hunger for information and to educate themselves. And they start reading blogs and listening to videos and listening to live casts like this so they can understand what exactly is happening and how can they explain to themselves this insanity that has happened, the crazy making that has happened over the recent years. So in order to dissolve the cognitive dissonance, a person has to face the truth relentlessly. That's very difficult because, as I mentioned, the cognitive dissonance causes the mind to want to go back to the good times or to think about the good in the abusers or going back to normal. But we have to face the truth relentlessly. So after an abusive relationship, I recommend that people write down a sobriety list. Sobriety in this case meaning the truth and reality, because when you're in an abusive relationship, you are subscribed to a form of collective fantasy that the abuser or abusers have created in that system. And so you need to start getting yourself out of that trance, out of that fantasy by forcing yourself to face the truth. So that sobriety list is a bullet pointed list of everything abusive that the abuser did that entire relationship. So that may be something you could do for yourself, is writing down all the crazy abusive things that they've done in the recent years and keep reminding yourself of those things when you start to doubt and go back into that cognitive dissonance. It's also important to speak the truth. Why? That's very scary to speak the truth about abuse in an abusive system because there will be retaliation from that. But when you speak the truth, you will be able to find allies because they're going to hear your truth, just like you found, JJ's live stream here. When you hear something that you recognize as truth, you feel a sense of alliance with that person. That's very much the case when you're coming out of an abusive system. You want to speak the truth and you find allies, and also you identify very quickly who are the enemies or who are the enablers of the abusers. Sometimes those enablers are good people and they don't realize what they're doing. But enablers can be both active or passively doing the bidding of the abusers. It is in fact the enablers that maintain the abusive system. The abusers would not have this power if we did not comply, if they were not people who carried on that compliance. And so when we talk about the spiritual war that's going on, the battle of good and evil, as Solzhenitsyn says, we have to look first within our own hearts. We have to recognize, are we participating in evil? Right? That's very important. Are we enabling, whether passively or actively, what's happening? We don't want to do that. So a person will then need to start to create a new life separate from the abusive system. Now that's very difficult when you're leaving a family system. It's so hard to leave that system, which you were deeply programmed to believe is your sense of social support and safety in life. Now we're talking about society. It's even more difficult to completely opt out of that and create a new life because we don't have these alternative parallel systems yet. Then hopefully these will start to be built over time. So then a person will need to start rebuilding their self-worth. The self-worth is the bottom foundation, the important foundation of the self-healing process after abuse. And in order to rebuild your self-worth after this incredible degradation of human rights that has taken place, and you were taught, programmed to believe that you are worthless, that you are not worthy of your most basic human rights. So what can you do? You need to identify your personal values, write those down. That's what really matters to you. Understand what those are, because then you can set up standards, what that should look like in real life, and then boundaries, the line that you're going to draw to protect what most matters to you. And as you put that into practice, you rebuild your self-worth naturally. So it's important to work on personal trauma recovery. When we talk about healing the world, we have to start within. Now, it's also impossible to heal from the situation while we're still in it. Okay, we are still in this ongoing abusive situation, even though some people have the perception that it's over. It's not. It's in this cycle, and we're going to keep continuing. But what's interesting is that every new trauma, every new loss triggers up to the surface the old unresolved traumas and sense of loss. So you may have noticed in the last 3 years that your prior personal traumas are starting to come up to the surface. Those are the things that you can start working on healing. It's kind of like clearing your cache off of your computer, your device, so that you can start to function more effectively here and now, even though we're still in this abusive situation. And as each of us takes responsibility and cleans up our little portion of the universe, as we transmute our own traumas, we participate in and create the collective trauma healing that's going to happen in society. The answer is not out there. The answer starts inside. And so it's really important to understand that your choices create your legacy. So down the road, years later, when you look back and you're telling the story about this time to your children, your grandchildren, the people that you're mentoring, what are you going to tell them? What is your participation? What is your role now in your family, in your community, and in your country? So that's my presentation for today. JJ, I'm going to open up that to you if you have any questions or comments, or anybody else.
Holy cow. So I have a lot of questions. I can give you a few, and then I don't want to ruin what was absolutely one of the best presentations I've seen in a very, very long time. Clearly, you've been delivering this message for a while, and it's a really good one. Where does I don't even know where to start. Where does the phenomenon of the avatar in social media play a role here? And let me clarify what I mean by that. People have this extra layer of their self-image, which is the extra cocky, smart, has everything going for them person on Facebook. That's an extra layer of this which doesn't exist in like an abusive marriage, or it's an extra layer of places for people to lose touch with who they are. Am I identifying a problem here that makes this even worse? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, you're totally right. That's part of a fantasy, right? That avatar is a fantasy of their sense of self, and a person's sense of self is lost anyways in an abusive relationship. And so on top of that, when they create that false sense of self, maybe that's receiving reward and praise for being a good, compliant citizen and those sorts of things. That is an extra complication.
Yeah, it seems like a real place where people could lose touch with what they're really experiencing versus what they're telling themselves they're experiencing, right? And it's a real dangerous thing, I think. I guess especially for young people. One of the things that I found quite extraordinary about something that I saw on BBC is that this stuff has an especially huge effect on children who already didn't have a lot of control over their daily lives, where the only time they were outside of the house at school, they have still pretty rigid controls on their behavior. And then that also got ramped up. But what part of the trauma that occurred to my children is because they have subconsciously or consciously perceived me as being unable to protect them from these changes. Do you think that factors in at all?
That is a very interesting perception, and it makes a lot of sense because kids need to understand that the adults have things under control. Otherwise, they get scared, right? And I think you really hit a nail on the head there.
Yeah, it dawned on me the other day because my mother-in-law is in the house, and it's become very introspective father zone at this stage, and we got into a little heated discussion about this, and I realized as I was trying to articulate what I was feeling, it felt very much like I couldn't protect my kids from what was happening, and I was feeling this helplessness, which I hadn't identified until a few days ago. That saying it also, as you said in your talk, really helps. But that slide at the end where it's not over until it's over is so vital. And it was something actually that a message that I also needed as well, because sometimes I can think I've repeated myself so often. I mean, how many more times can I repeat it? But all of us have to keep repeating it. And I think that was what so wonderful about this. I haven't felt this much hope in a long time. I have to tell you that. I mean, I'm still scared and I'm still worried about the future, but I feel like this has been a real important ray of light in a very dark couple of weeks. And so how long have you been circulating, and where else have you presented this, and how can we amplify this? Can we share other videos? Have you been on other shows that have more traction than mine? Where else can we look for you?
I've been on a few shows and podcasts. I first presented this at Dr. Reiner Fuelmick's Grand Jury of Public Opinion in February this year.
Oh, wow.
And so I put that out there. And then I've done this on a few other podcasts, and mostly on medical freedom, natural health, these sorts of topics. I do have a Rumble channel. It's not getting very much traction yet, but I put clips from those interviews on my Rumble channel,
Okay.
which is if you look under Meredith Miller or Inner Integration, you'll find that. And I also write on Substack. So I write long form articles explaining some
What's
of
your
these
Substack?
concepts. It's Inner Integration.
Oh, okay.
If you look up, actually look up Meredith Miller. I'm sorry. It's Meredith Miller, but it's called Inner Integration.
I also have a slide here for your website, which I will put up now.
Yeah, all the links are on the website.
That's a much easier way to do it here. That is this one. And so sometimes it's best with these things if they're digestible and shareable. And if you promise to come and talk to me again, I think I should cut it short here, because I think any discussion after this will be had on the next show. And I'm going to go through my notes one more time here, because I did take a lot of them, but it's crazy. I can't stress enough how important it is that people understand that this isolation and what it has done to us, the isolation from contact, the kinds of, it's just unprecedented. It is absolutely unprecedented. And the idea that perhaps it wasn't our fault is crazy, because to me, it's just shocking. Oh yeah. So a couple things that I wanted to remind you of biologically, which will fit into your slides. Let me go back so they can see you again. I still had your website up. You said examples of perceived kindness. One of the things that I've been forgetting to say, because it's like 3 years ago now, is there were a whole bunch of, in my mind, they were basically just throwing us a bone when they said that we're going to hold off on the J&J for a little while, because it seems like there are some safety signals and we want to be super careful. So it's like, we're going to be real cautious here. And because we're being real cautious over here, you can trust us on all this stuff over here, because obviously we have your best interest in mind. And so this also happened, as you said, with masks, because it was there and not there. And then the worst part is, and Meredith, you may not even be aware of it, but just last Friday, they had a White House presentation with Jill Biden, Fauci, Shah, and a representative from AARP, the retirement people. And they went on a 20-minute full court press about how the way out is vaccines. The way out, the way to escape is vaccines. And people who deny this don't want to get out. And they even went so far as to say that if you have any doubts, you should tell the parents of your grandchildren that they have to listen to us. So it was it was so extraordinary. They just said it right out loud. If I was a grandparent, I would tell the parents of my grandkids to get those kids vaccinated, or I'm not coming to Christmas. Wow. That's some serious, serious stuff. So the game is still full court press. And so we have a lot of work to do because it is a whole society that is in need of healing. And I think your message is a very important one, so I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share it with us today. And I hope that we can circle back and maybe do a more in-depth discussion in a few weeks, or if that's okay with you.
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, take care. Have a good afternoon. I know you have a meeting pretty soon. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me. This has been Gigaohm Biological. I'm going to be on in about 45 minutes with a national immunology update where I'm going to recap Michael Singer's coverage of me on his Substack. And then tomorrow, actually, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Michael Singer is going to come and join me for a live stream where we can discuss the things that he got wrong or maybe didn't get quite right in the nuances of his presentation of that stream. And we can move the ball forward a little bit more and get me out of the no virus box, which I'm sure everybody's thrown me in over the last 6 days. Thank you very much for joining me. This has been Gigaohm Biological, a high resistance, low noise information stream brought to you by a biologist. This has been Meredith Miller. You can find her here at innerintegration.com, where you can also find her Substack and all that other stuff. I think it's been a really great person to get in contact with, and I hope you'll share her work as well. I'll see you guys in about an hour or so. I don't know. Let's see. It's 2 o'clock now. 3 o'clock. It might be. Maybe it'll be 4. I was eating pea soup, so I know if that looked gross, but there's some meat in there too. Anyway, thanks guys for joining me. I'll see you guys soon.